Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to take you through just some busy stuff that we've had going on in the kitchen. Here where I live, a few times a month, there is an organization that salvages produce. And it's an amazing thing because you really never know what you're getting. Like, for example, my husband picked up these ones and we ended up with like 25 pounds of grapes. And I don't know about you, but that is a lot of grapes for us. We don't eat grapes very often. My husband actually hardly ever eats grapes because he was pre-diabetic before, and so he really watches his sugar intake. And you may or may not know, but grapes are one of the highest natural sugar content fruits out there. So he limits his grapes. But anyway, I couldn't figure out really what I was going to do with that many grapes. So I decided go ahead and pick them all off the stems, pick out any yucky ones, get them washed up, and I was going to try to make a grape jam. Now, you normally see grape jam made with like the pretty red or burgundy colored grapes, but green grapes actually make jam too. They just kind of make a weird color, which you will see later. But anyway, I couldn't really figure what else to do, so I like to add a little bit of vinegar and kind of do a fruit wash. And I let things soak like this for about 10 minutes. I do this with most fruits and vegetables that I get, unless I've grown them myself. I just kind of like to make sure they're as clean as possible. Okay, one of the other things that came in this bundle was a whole bunch of lemons, and these are great lemons. So I decided, well, with making jam, I definitely need some lemon juice. So I squeezed out a bunch of lemons, and then I also decided to cut a bunch in half, slice a bunch, and I flash froze them for like 2 hours in the freezer on a flat cookie sheet, and then I put them into individual bags. So now I have lots and lots of lemons in my freezer for future use. So anyway, once I rinsed them off, and I put some fresh water just to make sure there's no vinegar residue left on there. And now they're going into my stock pots. I have 2 of these large regular stock pots that I am just going to use to cook down my grapes for the jam. And I decided to go with a recipe that didn't need pectin. I thought if I could do a sugar recipe, sugar and lemon juice, and just try to cook it down enough, I wondered if I could get it to thicken enough without actually having to add the pectin. And it's not because I don't like pectin. I just decided to try something that was a little more natural. And my bread scale that I use for sourdough came in really handy. I was just trying to get an idea of my weight ratio with these. So it was nice because I was able to switch the numbers on my bread scale over from grams, which I normally use when I'm making sourdough, over to pounds, which I was trying to do with the grapes. And again, each of these measuring cups held actually about 6 pounds worth of grapes. And so I just kept rinsing them, kept cleaning them, kept adding them to my stock pots until I felt like they were at a level that would be good for baking in. And then actually had a lot of grapes left over, so I decided to freeze some, which I think I'll show you that in a little bit. And I also gave probably 4 or 5 pounds away at the end. This was a lot of grapes. But anyway, into the stock pot, I have 2 stock pots going. I'm going to do another one in a minute. I added the sugar, excuse me, and I did a half a cup of sugar for every 2 pounds of grapes. So that's a lot less sugar than most recipes called for, but I didn't want this to be overly sweet because these grapes were actually really sweet as well. And then that was 1 tablespoon of lemon juice per 2 pounds of grapes. So that was, I can't remember, that was a couple of tablespoons of that freshly squeezed lemon juice. And I just started getting it all stirred up and incorporated together. And then I put it on over a medium heat. And then while that started heating up, I got my second stock pot going, did the exact same thing. I was originally going to do this one with monk fruit sweetener instead of sugar, but I completely spaced that. And anyway, I did it like this. So once they got heated up and I felt like the sugar was mixing in well, I used my immersion blender to start mashing up those grapes. Now, I also debated using just like a mashed potato, like a smasher, and that probably would have worked fine too. but I love this immersion blender and I don't get to use it very often. And so I thought, well, this is a great idea. Just if you do this method, this is hot. I did take it off the stove while I was using the immersion blender, but it is, that's hot boiling liquid. So be really careful if you do that because you don't want to burn yourself. So while that was cooking, and that actually took a good 45, 50 minutes to cook down, I got some more grapes, actually the rest of them washed off, and I decided to line 2 of my giant baking sheets with I did wax paper, and then I lightly dried off the grapes, and I spread them out amongst the paper, and I stuck these in my big freezer to flash freeze, and then later I put them into individual bags. So I just kept checking my mixture because it needed to cook down a lot. And like I said, it took 45, 50 minutes. When it was finally done, look how dark it got. I really wasn't sure what to expect with doing these green grapes. And the few videos I had seen online or pictures I had seen online showed them really light and like champagne colored. But I guess for whatever reason, these ones just darkened. But that's okay. Doesn't matter. Kind of looks like apple butter. Anyway, with my wooden spoon, I just started smishing it through the strainer as much as I can. I wanted to get as much liquid out of there as possible, and then I knew I was going to run those remnants in through my blender anyway, because I wanted to make a jam, not a jelly. Jelly's clear, jam has texture, and I like jam a little bit better. So anyway, into my ninja blender, I started scooping that thick portion of it. I just wanted to pulse it up because I didn't want any big pieces of skin or pithy areas. I still want the jam to be smooth when you spread it onto bread. I just needed to pulse it up a bit. So I have a Ninja. Someday I'll probably have a Vitamix. I would love to have a Vitamix, but the Ninja actually works really, really well. So once it was blended, I just took it out of there and then I poured it back into the liquid mixture. And then I just stirred it in together, and it made actually a really nice consistency. And I knew this is what I wanted for my jam. So I set it aside, and then I got my stock pot ready. I could not find my regular canning pot, and I'm guessing it's outside. I haven't done any canning in the last couple of years. Big canning. I've done small batches like in my little pressure canner, but I haven't done it in my really big pots. So I need to go find my big pot. This is one of the pots I use for making tamales, but it worked just fine. I also could not find my regular canning tongs that you use. I have these little dinky metal ones, and they're kind of sucky. So, but the silicone lined spatula actually worked really, really great. So if you're new to canning, you want to get your jars sterilized. I've already cleaned them, but then I put them in my water and I bring it to a rolling boil and I let that boil. I personally let it boil for like 15 minutes. I don't know what the protocol number is, but I've always done it about 15 minutes. Then I pull them out, keeping the water back in, and then I start to ladle my jam mixture into the jars. And it doesn't matter how tidy I try to be, I am a messy pourer, and I feel like I take my time and I scoop slowly, but for some reason, even with the funnel, I make a mess every single time. But anyway, and they're really hot too, so you want to have extra little things on hand. Like I always have a dish towel handy or a rag or something. And yeah, so like I said, I'm kind of messy, but you can clean them up later. You always want to make sure you're leaving about an inch of headspace at the top of your jar when you're canning. And so I just visually think, don't go up into where the rings are at the top of the jar. The reason for that is during canning, they boil. It boils more and it expands, and that if you go up too high, you can bow the lid or you can shatter the jar. And I've done both of those things, lots of trial and error with canning. I was really, really into canning in my 20s and even my early 30s when my kids were young. I loved canning. Now I'm getting back into all of my good homesteading traits, but there was probably a 14, 15 year span of time where I didn't do as much. But anyway, Once you get everything poured into your jars, you want to make sure the tops are clean. So I have some hot water on a rag here, and I'm going around and I'm making sure all of my tops of my jars are clean. And then I have my lids. I also boiled those in a thing of hot water, and I'm just using my little magnet lid lifter and setting the lids down onto all of them. It's okay to touch the tops. I just try to keep it as, it's not really truly a sterile environment, but as clean as possible. You don't want germ transfer. And then once those are all on, you just tighten down your ringers. I just finger tight them. I don't go really, really hard with these because they're going to tighten or loosen while they're processing in the canner. But I just get them all ready, and then I'm going to make sure there's no residual jam on there, and then I'm going to attempt to carefully lower them in, because remember, this water is still boiling and it is hot and it will splash, so you want to be really careful. And I did put a small rack in the bottom of this pot because it's not a regular canning pot, and I wanted to not have my jars touching the bottom. You want to give that little distance between the stove surface and the bottom of your glass jars. Okay, they are done, and I let them, yeah, see, that's why you need good grabbers for your cans, because these ones are crappy. Anyway, I let them process for 10 minutes at a full rolling boil, and actually sometimes it can take a while for it to come back to a boil after you drop them in, so just take that into consideration. Elevation is a factor with the amount of time you will need to process, and then of course what you're actually processing in the jar. Depending on the acidity level, things like that, you will need to can them for more or less time. And I highly recommend getting a book. Like Ball puts out a great canning book, and definitely recommend getting a book for your canning. I just space them out so they've got some airflow. They are up on a lifted drying rack, and I always put like a dish towel on top of there too, and they're just gonna let them sit there and they're gonna suck down and it'll be awesome. So while that's happening, I moved outside and picked some fresh basil. I have a whole bunch of different things I need to make, and I've got this giant mass of basil. It's one of the only things happy in my summer garden here in Arizona. So we're dealing with a bunch of abundance today, and so I'm going to use this basil because I have a bunch of tomatoes that I would like to roast, and I thought basil would be delicious with it. So I'm just washing off my basil leaves, and I'm spreading them out, and I just sort of roll them in a paper towel just to sort of lightly dry them off. It's not the end of the world. They're getting cooked, so if they have some water left on them, that's okay. So in that big basket of produce that I was talking about that we picked up, there was a whole bunch of cherry tomatoes, like 12 pounds of cherry tomatoes. So I cleaned them, and now I decided these would be so good roasted with fresh basil and olive oil and garlic. And so I'm just cutting them all in half, and they're just absolutely this beautiful summer color arrangement. Thought they were so cool. So I'm cutting them all in half, and then they're going to go onto a baking sheet, and I will add some fresh olive oil and chop up some garlic. And if you have watched a lot of my other videos, you know that I keep a large quantity of already peeled garlic cloves in my freezer. I think it is the absolutely easiest way to grab garlic and not have to spend so much time peeling it. I actually buy pre-peeled garlic from the Asian market here, and I get a few pounds of it for like $4. I just think it's the best thing ever. So I just keep it in a mason jar in my freezer, and then I just pop out the cloves I need, and I'm just mincing them up for this recipe. So I think I used about 4 smaller cloves of minced garlic for this whole thing of tomatoes. So once that's all done, I spread my tomatoes around, and then I added, I just kind of roughly pulled apart the basil just in little chunks, and I spread it all over my tomatoes. Um, I could have used oregano, probably would have been really good in here too, but I just kind of had this tomato, basil, olive oil, garlic idea going on. And in case you're wondering, I know I talked about this abundance of produce we got, but there's a company and it's called Borderlands Produce on Wheels. And what they do is they go around and they rescue produce. Like maybe a grocery store ordered too many and they can't use them all. Or maybe they're just not as perfect as some would like it to be. That's where they come from. And you get like 70 pounds of produce for like $20. It is a wonderful deal. Anyway, so I added a little bit of pink Himalayan salt, and I'm just adding a little bit of extra virgin olive oil, and now I am just incorporating it all together. I don't really know a better way than just using your hands to incorporate that, but I spread them back out across my baking sheet, and I preheated my oven to 240 degrees. And so these are going into the oven at 240 degrees, and I will let them cook. I checked them after 1 hour, and then they actually cooked for 2.5 hours. So while those were in the oven, I went out and harvested some more basil from my garden and some flowers, because I am all about making flower arrangements with whatever you have. I think foraging with what you can get out of your own yard is a wonderful way to use what you have and also bring some of the color into the house. And it's summertime right now, and I'm in Arizona, and it's really hot in Scottsdale, Arizona. So I don't have a whole lot of stuff growing, but I do have zinnias and I do have a lot of basil. So I take advantage of that basil, and I don't mind the flowers in my arrangements. So I leave those little tops on, pick the zinnias, I just strip the leaves off. And I have these old stoneware milk bottles. I collect stoneware bowls and crocks and things like that. And I think they make wonderful flower arrangement holders. So I'm just putting one together. I've been doing this every week for most of the summer. I just change it out once a week. And yes, it's been zinnias and little cosmos and basil, but it looks so pretty, and actually with the basil in the flower arrangements, it smells great too. So I highly recommend doing this. I make a little teeny one, and I usually put it by my stove because that adds a little pop of color by the stove, and the other one goes on my dining room table, and I just love it. Side note, if you do live here in the valley, I'm going to be teaching a class at Barrage Nursery in November all about foraging and flower arranging. So you should check that out if you are here in the valley. It would be great. I'd love to see you. You can check out my website for information on that. How pretty it looks. So back in the kitchen, and the tomatoes are done, and oh my gosh, I wish I could send you a scent over the computer, because this smells so delicious, and they've reduced down and they're like wilty, and I need to jar them and save them. So I used my quart size mason jars. I didn't know how much these would reduce down, but I actually managed to shove this entire batch of tomatoes into one mason jar. I just packed it in there really, really tight, and it worked so great. So one thing you want to do if you're going to save roasted vegetables like this, roasted tomatoes, you want to make sure you add enough olive oil after the fact that you're covering the tomatoes completely with it. I'm not canning these. I'm just going to keep them in my fridge for a couple of weeks, and they should easily last 3 to 4 weeks, but you need to top them with an oil, like whatever carrier oil you're using. So I poured some olive oil in there, and then I got a chopstick, and I'm just sort of pulling away from the sides to remove any air bubbles or gaps where the oil is not touching the tomatoes. So I just kept adding a little bit more again and again and again, and making sure that I released all of the air bubbles. And then I actually had to take a piece of fresh sourdough and add some to it because it just smelled so good I had to taste it. But anyway, so these will keep in the fridge for 3 to 4 weeks, and then be ready to top with on bread like bruschetta or on pasta, and be really delicious. Okay, so with the rest of the basil, I decided to go ahead, clip the rest of the flowers off of it. I sort of let that dry out a little bit after I washed it. And I'm just making a bundle and I'm going to wrap it with twine and I'm going to hang it um, in a spot where I like to hang vegetables and things to dry out for future use. And yes, I have a whole bunch of basil and I need to do more from the garden, but I just wanted to use this little bit right now. So just hang it up here next to my string of peppers and it'll be usable soon. Thank you so much for watching.